So today I'm going to go through this article from the United Nations website, which was written by Secretary General Antonio Guterres. It's called Global Wake Up Call, and essentially it's another call for the entire planet to accept the global governance of the United Nations. Before I get to that, first I want to once again refresh your memory on that Rockefeller document from 2010. You know, the lockstep narrative they talked about, the hypothetical pandemic that would lead to a world of tighter top-down control. Now, they predicted that this was going to happen in 2012, but nevertheless, you'll see some striking similarities between that prediction and what's going on right now with COVID-19. You know, I'm reminded of that quote by Alan Kay: the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And this Rockefeller document from 2010 is basically a guidebook, a pre-written script that pretends to be nothing more than a hypothetical scenario, but it is in fact a blueprint for the very pandemic crisis we're living through. Written 10 years ago, it talks about authoritarian leadership that followed a global viral outbreak, the breakdown in supply chains, the high negative impact on economies. It says the pandemic also had a deadly effect on economies, international mobility of people and goods screeched to a halt, debilitating industries like tourism and breaking global supply chains. Even locally, normally bustling shops and office buildings sat empty for months, devoid of both employees and customers. And it also praises China's response. It says, the Chinese government's quick imposition and enforcement of mandatory quarantine for all citizens, as well as its instant and near-hermetic sealing off of all borders, saved millions of lives, stopping the spread of the virus far earlier than in other countries and enabling a swifter post-pandemic recovery, which is basically what happened during the COVID-19 crisis. China has always been the globalists' ideal model for the New World Order society. It's a massive police state with no respect for citizens' rights or privacy. The scenario continues. China's government was not the only one that took extreme measures to protect its citizens from risk and exposure. During the pandemic, national leaders around the world flexed their authority and imposed airtight rules and restrictions, from the mandatory wearing of face masks to body temperature checks at the entries to communal spaces like train stations and supermarkets. Sound familiar? Even after the pandemic faded, this more authoritarian control and oversight of citizens and their activities stuck and even intensified. I think that was kind of the point of the plandemic in the first place. In order to protect themselves from the spread of increasingly global problems, from pandemics and transnational terrorism to environmental crisis and rising poverty, leaders around the world took a firmer grip on power. Ominous. And we're seeing that exact thing happen right now. If the COVID-19 panic really was just about a virus, why would it be so necessary to radically alter our societies? For citizens to lose all of their rights and freedoms and to be so heavily surveilled and controlled. It also says, at first, the notion of a more controlled world gained wide acceptance and approval. Citizens willingly gave up some of their sovereignty and their privacy to more paternalistic states in exchange for greater safety and stability, which is exactly what we're seeing now. Citizens were more tolerant and even eager for top-down direction and oversight, and national leaders had more latitude to impose order in the ways they saw fit. In developed countries, this heightened oversight took many forms. Biometric IDs for all citizens, as we know, that's coming on stream, for example, and tighter regulation of key industries whose stability was deemed vital to national interests. And we saw that so many businesses were shut down because they were deemed non-essential. It's very clear that globalists want to control the most important and essential aspects of the economy, things that everybody needs. Energy production, food, water, telecommunications, medicine, land usage, environment, and even money itself, by bringing about a cashless society. In many developed countries, enforced cooperation with a suite of new regulations and agreements slowly but steadily restored both order and, importantly, economic growth. But as we've seen, quality of life has not been restored. So it seems as if we're about to move into an era of massive instability and regular outbreaks in order to justify increased control measures and for humanity to surrender its freedoms for more so-called security. The bit about mandatory wearing of face masks and temperature checks is obviously eyebrow-raising, considering that's what we're currently living through. Keep in mind that the Rockefeller Foundation are also involved in ID 2020, the digital identity, which will include vaccine information. Now, with all of that said, let's get into the UN article by Antonio Gutierrez. From COVID-19 to climate disruption, from racial injustice to rising inequalities, we are a world in turmoil. Yes, contrived chaos created to justify bringing about global order, kind of like the Rockefeller document as described. At the same time, we are an international community with an enduring vision, embodied in the United Nations Charter, which marks its 75th anniversary this year. That vision of a better future, based on the values of equality, mutual respect, and international cooperation, has helped us to avoid a third world war that would have had catastrophic consequences for life on our planet. Strange, to me it feels like we're actually living in a third world war, a war not against a foreign opponent, but one that's being fought against humanity itself. The pandemic has laid bare severe and systemic inequalities, both within and between countries and communities. More broadly, it has underscored the world's fragilities, not just in the face of another health emergency, but in our faltering response to the climate crisis, lawlessness in cyberspace, and the risks of nuclear proliferation. People everywhere are losing trust in political establishments and institutions. Just absolute hysterical, sky-is-falling levels of garbage there. And the bit about lawlessness in cyberspace is basically referring to the fact that the internet is a place where narratives can be challenged. I love this nonsense about trust in political establishments and institutions, as if people should just blindly follow them without question. Unfortunately, to a large extent under this crisis, that's exactly what they're doing. He says the emergency is compounded by many other profound humanitarian crises. Conflicts that are continuing or even intensifying. Record numbers of people forced to flee their homes, swarms of locusts in Africa and South Asia, looming droughts in Southern Africa and Central America, all amid a context of rising geopolitical tensions. In the face of these fragilities, world leaders need to be humble and recognize the vital importance of unity and solidarity. No one can predict what comes next, but I see two possible scenarios. First, the optimistic possibility. In this case, the world would muddle through. Countries in the global north would engineer a successful exit strategy. Developing countries would receive enough support, and their demographic characteristics, namely the youth of their people, would help contain the impact. And then perhaps a vaccine would appear in the next 9 months or so. So that sounds like some telegraphing there. And would be distributed as a global public good, a people's vaccine, available and accessible to all. Hard pass on that one, but feel free to take it yourself, Antonio. If this happens, and if the economy starts up progressively, we might move towards some kind of normality in 2 or 3 years. Or we could attempt to mitigate further societal and economic catastrophe right now by scrapping masks, COVID testing, rolling lockdowns and social distancing, and come to our senses, thus returning to the world that we used to live in. But there is also a second, bleaker scenario, as if the first scenario wasn't bleak enough, in which countries fail to coordinate their actions. New waves of the virus keep occurring. The situation in the developing world explodes. Work on the vaccine lags. Or even, if there is a vaccine relatively soon, it becomes the subject of fierce competition, and countries with greater economic power gain access to it first, leaving others behind. So as you can see, both scenarios are actually quite similar. The vaccine is presented as a solution in both cases. So it's the illusion of choice. So to me, it sounds like in both scenarios they win. It's just that in the second scenario, it takes them a little bit longer. In this scenario, we could also see greater movement toward fragmentation, populism, and xenophobia. Each country could go it alone, or in so-called coalitions of the willing to address some specific challenges. In the end, the world would fail to mobilize the kind of governance needed to address our shared challenges. So here you go, a call for global governance. In other words, he wants people to accept the United Nations as an unelected central government of the planet. The result may well be a global depression that could last at least 5 or 7 years before a new normal emerges, the nature of which is impossible to predict. It is very difficult to know if we are moving in one direction or the other. We must work for the best and prepare for the worst. The pandemic, as horrible as it is, must be a wake-up call that prompts all political leaders to understand that our assumptions and approaches have to change, and that division is a danger to everyone. Yes, we have to have groupthink now. This understanding could lead people to recognize that the only way to address global fragilities is through much more robust mechanisms of global governance with international cooperation. Translation: only a global one-world government can stop all of the terrible scenarios presented in this article. Classic snake oil sales tactic. It's such a desperate attempt for countries to surrender their sovereignty to the United Nations. But actually, this seeming desperation might just go to show how afraid they are of losing this opportunity to finally have their glorious new world order. After all, we cannot simply return to the systems that gave rise to the current crisis. Translation: we're not going back to the way things were, when actually we could. We need to build back better with more sustainable, inclusive, gender-equal societies and economies. Sounds like global communism is the solution to all of these straw man issues. In doing so, we must reimagine the way nations cooperate. Today's multilateralism lacks scale, ambition, and teeth, and some of the instruments that do have teeth show little or no appetite to bite. As we have seen in the difficulties faced by the Security Council, we need a networked multilateralism in which the United Nations and its agencies, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, regional organizations such as the African Union and European Union, trade organizations and others work together more closely and effectively. And there you have it, the coming together of the various globalist groups to create one world of all the things. Just more and more power centralized into one organization, the UN, and the end of democracy because, after all, the citizenry don't get to vote for their UN representatives. So this is just a Trojan horse power grab. We also need a more inclusive multilateralism. Governments today are far from the only players in terms of politics and power. Civil society, the business community, local authorities, cities, and regional governments are assuming more and more leadership roles in today's world. So, more power being surrendered to unelected groups and businesses with no democratic accountability, thus bypassing the will of the people. Strengthen our capacity for global governance, give teeth to multilateral institutions, and draw from the power of unity and solidarity to overcome the biggest test of our times. The trouble is, if the populace truly are in a state of mass psychosis and compliance due to their hysteria and fear over the virus, it is possible that they would simply sleepwalk into watching their politicians acquiesce to the authority of the UN. It's the failure to hold elected leaders accountable due to distraction, fear, and a perceived urgency to take drastic actions because of what people are being told is an unprecedented crisis. That's so big that the rights and freedoms of the individual and the sovereignty of entire nation-states must be extinguished. This all ultimately goes back to the beginning of this video, the Rockefeller document from 2010 that talks about a world of tighter top-down control following a pandemic. Once again, it said even after the pandemic faded, this more authoritarian control and oversight of citizens and their activities stuck and even intensified in order to protect themselves from the spread of increasingly global problems, from pandemics and transnational terrorism to environmental crisis and rising poverty. Leaders around the world took a firmer grip on power. All of these manufactured world problems have always been used as part of a Trojan horse power grab. These are lies and scams perpetuated through media propaganda to scare the populace and encourage them to willingly surrender their inalienable human rights and freedoms for more so-called security. The purpose of this plandemic was to change every aspect of human society at a foundational level, and due to the compliance of the public and their general ignorance, emotionality, and, I hate to say, stupidity, that's exactly what's happened. Also, there's a great video by Amazing Polly that you have to check out, and it explores the various ways in which humanity is effectively being tortured by this crisis, and the populace generally doesn't even know that these tactics are taking place. I will leave that video linked below for you. So in conclusion, there's two possibilities here that one could deduce from this UN article. Either Gutierrez is worried that this golden opportunity to achieve global governance might be slipping away for some reason, or he knows they're getting very close to achieving it, and he's simply a bit nervous because he's aware that it's within reach, and he simply wants to make sure that all of the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. Thank you very much for watching this video. Be sure to share it far and wide if you can. Follow me over on BitChute, Minds, and Gab. All the links to my social media are below, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.